Hi, I'm Joanne Banko, author and online educator at Let's Go Sew. Have you ever wanted to just freshen up your dining room and maybe add some chair pads to your seating? Well, I think if you thought that way, you're going to love this project today. What I've done is just taken some plain fabric, created some striking piping, and created basically a slipcover style cushion. So let me show you the finished one here. I've got ties that attach to the chair. I've got a nice, like I said, fancy cording that I created myself on the machine with decorative stitches, and then a slipcover for the opening here. It's very easy, just like you would have maybe for an interchangeable pillow, and a place to put that foam cushion. So let's talk about supplies. First of all, you want to start with a home decor weight fabric so that you have some stability there. And certainly could be a print, and you certainly could use purchased piping if you want to, if you find something that you like in that. But this is a fun technique I think you're going to like. As far as the cushion foam itself, I love working with this foam that's called densified foam. And one of the things I like about it is it's very, very, very easy to trim. So unlike other foams that require you to use, special type of electric cutting systems, this you can just use good quality heavy duty shears and you can trim that right off. So it's very easy to do. For the pattern, you could take your existing chair and you could put paper over it and you could literally trace around the shape and you could create a pattern that way. You're going to need a pattern obviously for the top, and this is sized so it's a little bit smaller than my actual chair. And I did not add any seam allowance to this. That's usually your first thought, but we're adding piping, and that piping is essentially going to take up, give that outer area the same amount that seam allowance would have given us when we sewed together. If you choose to forego the piping, then yes, add whatever seam allowance, 3/8 of an inch, 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch, whatever you want. So I have a top piece, and then I've also got the back piece. So the back piece needs to have that overlap. You can see here my back piece, my top piece, and you've got to have that area there. So that is cut the same size, but with an extension on the upper half. So I've just labeled mine pattern A, pattern B. And then you've got the pattern for the foam. Now the foam, you want it to be a little bit smaller than your actual cushion. Now I would err on the side of a little bit smaller first time around. You can always trim that up if you find that it's too tight of a fit, and trim that down a little bit more so that it fits a little more snugly in there. But I start with about a 1/2 inch, so that would fit on there. And I just simply lay it on my foam. Make sure if you're going to use this size, you should be able to use a foam that's kind of a standard size, but you may need to shop for foam that's a little bit bigger in size. Okay, so let's go ahead and head over to the machine, and I'm going to show you how I did the piping technique. So I started off with a piece of bias that is, of course, to make my piping. I've got a decorative foot on the machine, and I've selected a decorative stitch from my decorative menu, one of the geometric stitches. They're known as elongation stitches, and they're called that because you can actually set the length and then the pattern repeat so that it's a little bigger or a little bit smaller. So I've set mine to be a little smaller, and I've also shortened the stitch length a little bit so that I've got a nice tight stitch. I've got a piece of tearaway stabilizer underneath, and I want to go right along the center of this. So I'm going to turn on a feature here where I've got a guideline, and I'm going to move that guideline to the center. And you could chalk mark this, so if you want to be right in the center, that would be a good way to do it. I'm going to just use this guideline, and then I'm going to eyeball it. So I'm just going to sew that decorative stitch. Oh, I've got it set for one motif. We want to do it for a row because we want to continue. And I would do this with an embroidery type thread, so a shiny thread on top. And then for the bottom, you could use the same thread, or you could use a bobbin weight thread, the same type you would use for embroidery, in a white color, thinner, and it'll stay on the bottom. So let's just do a little bit more of this so that you can see. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end that. Take that out. Okay, so you can see how pretty that is. So the next step then would be to simply tear away my stabilizer. Get rid of all that excess. And now I'm going to change the foot. So I'm going to take the decorative foot off. I'm also going to change my thread really quick here. Back to regular sewing thread. You do want to use good quality, strong sewing thread for the actual construction of this project. Okay, get that needle threaded real quick, and I'm going to go back to the standard sewing screen there, and I'm going to start with a regular straight stitch. I'm going to now put on a piping foot. And I want to show you the underside of this foot has grooves, so that's going to allow me to guide right along that cording very easily. Another option would be to use a foot that has an adjustable part on it for doing cording. It's known as a zipper slash cording foot. Okay. I'm going to take my cording, and I've used I don't quite remember the size, but I know it's just a little bit more than a 1/4 inch. That works perfect with this foot. I'm going to wrap this around the cording. Okay, and I'm going to get that underneath the groove in the foot. And my first step is just going to be to simply run this along that cord with a basting length. Okay, so I'm going to increase that stitch length. And you want to get that right underneath there. I think I cut this little strip just a little skimpy, so make sure when you cut yours that you wrap it around your cord and do a test. You're going to see on my finished piece in a minute here that I did a better job on that. But you see, you want that to just go right along the edge, but not real snug, not real tight. Let me cut this and show you my finished one. Okay, because this is how you want it to look. So I use a standard straight stitch. I knew this was going to be a little bit of handling, but you would use a little bit longer, closer to a basting. So it's really nice and close up to that cord, but not quite as close as it's going to be when we stitch the final stitch. Okay, so we'll set this aside for just a minute, get that mess out of the way, and let me just show you how I created the ties. So I've got the steps here for you. So for the ties, you want to also, at least if you want to do it the way I did it, cut that out on the bias. So I cut bias strips of fabric. I think it just makes a nicer tie when you tie it. Bias is always more flexible and more smooth, so rather than cutting on the straight grain, I cut on a bias. They may be a little stiff if you cut them on straight grain. And I used a special stitch that's called a stretch stitch. I call it a lightning stitch because it looks like a lightning bolt. And I did that because when you turn this right side out, you're going to have a little bit of pull on it, and that'll keep this the seam from popping. I want you to notice one more thing that I did. I started out here my stitching with a very wide opening at the top, and that's so that when I go to turn this right side out, I use a standard loop turner. It's going to allow me to slip through that area easier and pull that right out to the right side. I'll give you another little tip on this. When you do turn these right side out, get something that you could wet your fingers a little bit so you can work it down with a little bit of damp finger. Okay, so that's how you make the ties. Let's set that aside. And now I want to show you what I would have done for the next step would be to baste my cording to my top piece. So I've already done that partially. I want to get back underneath here because I want to show you how I finish the ends. That's always a little bit tricky. And I want you to see how what I did here, I've put the cording now in the opposite side of the foot. There are 2 grooves in this foot which make it perfect for that. All right, so again, I'm going to move now. I'm going to go stay with the basting stitch, but I'm going to move my needle over just a little bit to the right so that it's not as close to the piping. Okay, and I've got this pinned raw edges together. My piping is right in that groove. I want to tell you too, a little trick here, when you're sewing piping to a curved edge, always push in that piping a little bit, ease it in. You can also clip it if you need to, but when that piping turns out to the outside, it's going to go from a smaller area to a larger area. And if you don't ease that in, when you turn it out, it's going to pull a little bit and you could get a little bit of a puckered seam. Okay, so I'm going to go all around here go ahead and feel free to use your presser foot up and down and pivot that a little bit so that you can work that around. And what I want to show you here is how I cross these two ends over. I've already done this first end, and hopefully you can see there. What I've done is I've opened that up, and I want to trim out all of that excess cording where they're going to overlap. So I'm going to snip that away. And I'm going to do the same thing on this end, so I'm just going to open that up a little bit, snip that away, and then I'm going to literally crisscross these two ends. Now, if you notice here, I've got a pin. That is the exact center of my top piece. Because when you look at that, when that's actually finished, you want that overlap to be right on the center. Take that pin out, right over. All right, I have got that part done. There's the presser foot. So you can see how perfectly that overlaps, and then when that's turned to the right side, you're gonna barely notice where those two have crossed. That really makes it easy, and I think it's a much easier way than taking it and trying to fold it over, especially if you've done this decorative stitch technique. You're gonna have a little bit of extra bulk there. Okay, so now what do we do next? Well, we go to our pieces that are already layered, and I've got them pinned together. So there's my front piece, there's my bottom A and bottom B with that overlap. I've just got some safety pins to keep that in there together. And now I'm going to go back to a regular standard stitch length. So that would be 2.5. Doesn't really matter where you start on this. Remember, that's all basted in place, but it's easier if you start on a little bit of a straight edge. So again, that's going to go in the groove. And what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to make sure that my needle is snugged up way close to where that piping is. So you may want to do a little bit of a test because the different thicknesses of fabric will make a difference. But I'm going to move that needle over to the left so that it's very, very close to that piping. And you kind of get, you can do it a little bit by sight, but you'll get a little bit of a feel for where that should be. And like I said, if you do a little test piece, then you'll know exactly what your setting should be. And then I'm going to be able to go all around and finish that seam. Get those layers all together. Just like that. When you're done, you'll turn everything right side out. You'll have beautiful cording like this. Slip your cushion inside, and you are ready to dress up your dining room with new, beautiful cushions. Visit the website. We've got free instructions.